So for our topic, we decided to do invasive species. Invasive species can harm both the natural resources and an ecosystem, and as well threaten the human use of these resources. Invasive species are capable of causing extinctions of native plants and animals and reducing biodiversity, competing with native organisms for limited resources, and altering habitats. Invasive species are primarily spread by human activities, often unintentionally. People and the goods we use travel around the world very quickly and often carry uninvited species around with them. So did you know that 42% of the threatened or endangered species are at risk due to the invasive species? Well, invasive species can be plants, insects, fish, fungus, bacteria, or even organisms, seeds, or eggs. So what exactly makes them successful? Well, some characteristics are lack of predators, pathogens, diseases that keep population numbers in check. They thrive on disturbances and are very opportunistic. They're fast growing, they're habitat generalists, and they do not have specific or narrow growth requirement. Some can produce chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants nearby. They have longer photosynthetic periods, and leaves in autumn often alter soil and habitat conditions where they grow better and suit their own survival and expansion. So when did it exactly become an issue? Well, it actually does create a competitive exclusion in some environments, which can lower resources for other animals and plants, and there's a niche displacement causing extinctions, hybridization, which is the mating of the two different organisms, introgression, and there's predation.
Background on invasive species. First, we'll begin with the economic impact on humans. Agricultural, forestry, and fishing are very important to the economy. Invasive species affect the productivity of these types of systems and limit the amount and abilities of producers to access export markets. This hinders economic growth and development. This means that if an economy is centered around food growth and the farmers, and the food is damaged by these invasive species, these farmers can't put that food out on the market and they can't make that money, which then eventually will hinder the economy and really damage it. Social impact on humans. Invasive species are a major threat to the lives of people living in areas in which they colonize. Through disrupting ecosystems, invasive plants, insects, and diseases, they impair many things humans need to sustain a good quality of life, including food and shelter, health, security, and social interaction. This means that if this invasive species comes and damages and harms these humans and gets them sick or gets them diseases, that means that obviously becomes a social problem and it'll create chaos for them. Environmental impact on humans. Invasive species alter and degrade the environment and have a negative effect on both native species and the people who live and work there. The decline in production can affect the diet of other animals and humans. Again, if these invasive species come and damage or harm the food, then the people that strongly rely and don't have other resources to food, then that can really affect their diet and really cause them to maybe go hungry. What is the importance of invasive species? Invasive species are an important issue because it causes ecological and economic damage to wherever they reside. Invasive species can outcompete native species, kill native plants and trees, destroy habitat, and overpredate native species within a particular area, potentially throw an entire ecosystem out of balance. As our global natural environment continues to undergo damage and development around the world, the disturbed and deteriorating ecosystems are now becoming increasingly vulnerable to invasive species.
So the scientific paper that we decided to review is called Beyond Frontiers on Invasive Alien Mosquito Species in America and Europe, by the authors Andre Weick, Giovanni Benelli, and John Beer. The article reviews how alien mosquitoes are responsible for the transmission of many pathogens and parasites to humans and animals. The invasive mosquito species is increasingly becoming a health concern in America. These mosquitoes have successfully reached parts of the Western Europe because of countries' vast psychological and ecological plasticity. This mosquito species has been detected in over 36 states of the U.S., and the dispersal of these species is accelerated through commercial transport of used tires and international trade. These are just two examples of the spread of an invasive mosquito species, but there are so many more undetected and neglected and potentially dangerous invasive species that need attention and probably should be monitored. The dispersion, establishment, and colonization of new areas by alien mosquito vectors have been researched and observed. These studies show how these mosquitoes reveal patterns of expansion to new areas. However, it is currently unknown what mechanisms are employed by invasive mosquitoes species to disperse establish. They also thrive in urban environments. Moreover, environmental and psychological features that trigger and support mosquito dispersal are also yet to be identified. It is feared that if these species are continued to be overlooked, that these species could continue to spread, establish, and create genetic variability. There are many other potentially dangerous neglected invasive species that only limited the information available on their ecology, behavior, and vector continents. After this research, they still continue to ask why invasive vector species are becoming locally abundant in urban habitats. These conductors also wish to spread awareness despite the underestimation many have about how harmful these species are.
So invasive species can happen from storms or ocean currents moving animals from one place to another. But the main culprit for this issue is actually humans. We do a lot of traveling, and we also trade a lot of items across seas. Sometimes bringing invasive species can be an accident because they will travel with us without our knowing of them being there, like the recent murder wasp that was found on a cargo ship in Washington. Or other animals such as zebra mussels will cling onto boats and travel across bodies of water into one the species isn't preyed on, so they get to thrive there and begin to overtake the beaches and drains. Sometimes we purposely purchase animals that may not be allowed in the area to have as pets. And then they get accidentally put out into wild, and animals like snakes and sugar gliders can roam free and start to breed and cause an issue. Other times we bring animals to an area on purpose, trying to solve an overpopulation of a different animal. For example, cranes and toads were moved out to Australia to help farmers out. Stuff with like the beetles that were eating all their sugar cane crops. After a little while though, the toads got out of the farm area and began breeding into the wild. The females can produce up to 7,000 to 35,000 eggs and can do this twice a year, even though an extremely low percentage actually grows up, but this still increases their population really fast. These toads are unfortunately poisonous too, since the other predators there haven't dealt with the creature. They don't have the immune system to handle their toxicity yet, so it allows the toads to roam freely and produce very quickly. Another animal people thought would help out were cats on the Macquarie Island. The island began having a rabbit and rodent problems back in 1890s, and because bunnies multiplied so fast, they thought bringing cats would reduce the population. Trying to fix one invasive species by bringing another was a continuous disaster for the island. Even though the bunny growth did decrease, now the cats are starting to take over as well. And because they would prey on all the birds, all the other animals would start decreasing a lot faster as well. The next step was to allow hunting of the animals to try and get all the ones that didn't belong off the island. After 2 centuries, millions of dollars, and a lot of environmental damage, as of December 2011, they are finally free. Invasive species can cost a country millions of dollars in order to try and fix it. What we do to help so this doesn't happen more often is boats must be cleaned and inspected before crossing over oceans. Planes have security checks to make sure you aren't bringing animals, plants, or fruits out of somewhere that will cause a problem. States will ban certain animals to be kept out of the location in case someone loses them and roam in a place without a predator. If there's an animal that you think is unknown to the area, there are phone numbers to call where they'll ask you to take a picture or describe it as best as you can, as well as the location you found the species at. The last resort is they allow hunting of the animal in order to decrease its population, but they try and take all other precautions first, so that hopefully it won't need hunting.
For our interview, we chose to interview Gary Lovett, which is a senior scientist at Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. And so I sent him an email with our questions. So the first question I asked is there any way to remove invasive species without actually harming the invasive species itself? And he said this depends on what kind of invasive species it is, if it's a plant, insect, mammal, reptile. And he said in all cases it is much easier to eradicate them if you catch the outbreak early before it has the chance to get established, before it makes that its home. And he said, and of course the best thing is to keep the invasive species out of the country in the first place. And then the next question I asked is said, what would you consider to be the most invasive species? And he asked the question, dangerous to what? Because he said the coronavirus is the most dangerous thing to humans right now. And then he said cheatgrass is dangerous to western grasslands. Imported insects are the most dangerous to eastern forests. And then I asked him this debatable question that scientists go round and round about right now is, what is his take on humans being an invasive species? And he said humans are endemic in Africa but invasive to the rest of the world. But since those invasions occurred many thousands of years ago, humans would be considered naturalized by most definitions because we have been here so long. It brings up an interesting question about how long a species needs to be here before it is considered native. A good example is honeybees, which were brought over in the first colonists in the 1600s, because now they would be considered normalized, but at the time they were considered an invasive species.